A forest ranger was discovered bound to a tree by German Shepherd canines. You'll cry when you see what they did next. Something unthinkable happened to a highly skilled group of canine German Shepherds during a normal practice in the icy mountains. Their handler was momentarily preoccupied and lost sight of them. The dogs wandered off into the thick woods, led solely by instinct and loyalty, at which point they noticed him. A man hanging helplessly from a cold tree, barely awake, bleeding, and beaten, with chains digging into his wrists. In the middle of nowhere, a forest ranger was abandoned for dead. However, the dogs performed something unexpected rather than running or barking aimlessly. The sequence of events that ensued was so accurate, poignant, and incredibly human that it moved even the most seasoned police to tears. This is more than simply a survival story. It's a potent lesson in courage, trust, and how sometimes the people we believe most need us end up saving us. Make sure you turn on notifications and subscribe to the channel, like this video before we start. That's how we keep telling these enduring tales of devotion, tenacity, and the unbreakable relationship between people and dogs. The pathways of Bitter Creek National Reserve were covered in a dazzling, shimmering blanket of snow that had been falling for hours. Only rangers like Thomas Grady dared to enter this area of Wyoming during the dead of winter. Thomas, 42, had dedicated 20 years of his life to defending the area, the wildlife, and the people that traversed it. However, he was shackled to a tree today and wasn't on patrol, pursuing poachers, or assisting lost hikers. He breathed in quick, freezing gasps. Ajax's temple was dripping blood, which trickled down to his frozen cheek. Like he was a part of the twisted pine. He was bound with heavy chains around his arms and torso. His wrists were already raw from being chained behind him. His suit was shredded and soaked with a mixture of blood and melting snow, and his flesh split open from struggle. He was barely conscious and could no longer feel his fingers. 2 days had passed since the ambush, and he recalled the irate voices muffled by ski masks. They desired access to the reserve land so they could engage in illicit hunting, logging, and other covert activities. When Thomas refused, they made fun of him and abandoned him in the woods to freeze and vanish forever. However, something was about to happen. Before there were gentle thuds crunching through the snow, there was only a murmur in the wind. Thomas's bulging eyes opened. He squinted to attempt to distinguish the dream from the trees, and that's when he noticed them. Was it another hallucination? The cold had been tricking him for hours. 5 dark shadows moving steadily and low against the snow. Initially, a wave of panic swept through his chest. His thoughts immediately turned to outdated survival training. Don't be afraid. But as the figures got closer, he saw that they weren't untamed predators, but rather German Shepherd canines at nightfall. Their coats were thick and covered in snow, and their eyes were bright and attentive. One of them, bigger than the others, went forward and smelled the air. They all walked purposefully, not like strays, but like troops on a mission. After he and Thomas locked eyes, an incredible thing occurred. The dog didn't snarl or bark. Like a statue, he sat directly in front of Thomas, his ears perked up and his chest proud. Then another one approached, sniffing the tree's base, while another started to circle the area. The others spread out in what appeared to be a tactical plan. These dogs were taught. They weren't lost. Half from the emotion and half from the wind, Thomas felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. Despite his inability to talk, he managed to mutter, "Good boys." Smelling at the chain, the Alpha Shepherd with the scar above his left eye stepped forward and gave a short, sharp bark. It reverberated among the trees. Although Thomas wasn't sure if anyone would hear, the dogs started acting out a scene. One of them dug in the snow around the chain, exposing the padlock. To warn someone or something, another leaped to his feet and began barking toward the sky. They seemed to know what needed to be done. Thomas drifted in and out of awareness for what seemed like hours, but he heard it just before darkness took him over once more. Footsteps in the distance, followed by a human voice saying, "Urgent, I see him over here." Thomas just managed to raise his head above the haze of pain and snow to see a man in a police uniform emerge from the trees, accompanied by several handlers. The dogs had succeeded in providing assistance, but Thomas received a final glimpse as his vision started to deteriorate. The alpha dog was glaring at him from a few feet distant. After passing out, Thomas woke up to the harsh smell of antiseptic and the soft beep of a heart monitor, not out of curiosity, not out of uncertainty, but comprehension. He felt as though nails had been driven into every bone and nerve in his body. He cautiously blinked at the glaring fluorescent light. His eyes were stinging from the ranger station's hospital light. This place was extremely heated. A nurse arrived next to him after he had been in the frigid woods for days. "You're safe now," she whispered kindly. "You're fortunate that they discovered you in time." When Thomas attempted to talk, his voice sounded raspy. "Where are the dogs?" she grinned. "They're outdoors. They've been waiting, especially one of the canine units that located you. The large one with the scar." Thomas returned his head to the cushion. It wasn't a dream. The Keenies were authentic. He felt a mixture of relief and controlled rage when Sheriff Dalton appeared in his face later that day. Dalton was a rugged man in his 50s, built like an oak tree and just as unmovable, he said. "Grady," he replied angrily as he drew a chair near. "You've got one hell of a story to tell." Thomas gave a slow nod. "How did they find me?" Dalton folded his arms and leaned back. "In the eastern forests, our K9 squad was conducting a winter training circuit. After a sudden whiteout, they lost contact with their handler. We believed they were lost until they made their own way back, but not to the checkpoint. They returned to the main station, barking like a snow-covered mole." Thomas closed his eyes and his chest tightened, but Rachel Vance, one of the handlers, felt something was off. She trusted them, loaded up the ATV, and followed them all the way to you. My life was saved by them. Dalton gave a nod. "Yes, but this is when things start to get weird. You were shackled to a tree in an area that hasn't been patrolled in more than 5 years," he said, taking a folder from beneath his arm and opening it to see a map of the forest with handwritten notes. "No fire roads, campgrounds, or active trails. Whoever dumped you understood exactly where to hide someone they didn't want discovered." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Illegal activities. They wanted me to be silent, and they nearly succeeded. We'll locate them," Dalton whispered. "But there's more." Dalton got up and opened the hallway door. After a moment, a big German shepherd with scarred eyes remained steady and peaceful. "Meet Valor," Dalton added, referring to the 8-year-old decorated military K9 who was discharged from service after his handler was murdered overseas. "Since then, he's had trouble adjusting," he said, stopping in the doorway and resting his ears forward before walking directly to Thomas's bed and gently resting his head on the mattress. "Doesn't trust or bond, but he chose you for some reason." With trembling hands, Thomas reached out and touched the dog's thick neck. Valor closed his eyes and leaned into the touch as if it were the only warmth he had ever experienced. "He hasn't left your side once," she said in a quiet whisper. "Even when I call, he waits for your approval." Thomas glanced at the canine. "He reminds me of the ranger I was before all of this dedication, tenacity, and watchfulness. Do you think he could work with you?" Rachel hesitated, then asked. Thomas gave a blink. "Do you mean that he is no longer serving in the military?" They stated that there was technically too much trauma. "But Valor's never connected with anyone. Like this, if you wanted to keep him, you'd both need to train and build the partnership. But I think he's already chosen," they added. Thomas was silent at first. He kept his gaze on the puppy without blinking. "If he's willing, I won't let him go," Thomas continued, suggesting that there was more than just words between them. At that moment, a loud bark pierced the silence. For a moment, courage held it in check. He got up fast, his nose high, his ears back, his muscles rigid. Rachel jumped up and down. Why is that child barking once more, louder and with greater urgency? A faint metal-on-metal clang came from the back of the building, but Thomas disregarded the discomfort. Shouting with his limbs, "That was the garage door," he remarked, as he picked up the radio off the bench. Before he could key it, the power went out. It all went dark. Rachel's flashlight beam slashed into the room with a shaky cone. "Stay here, and I'll see what it's like," she insisted. But then Valor growled. A guttural, deep sound. Then he moved to block the door. Rachel came to a halt. Thomas's voice was calming. "He doesn't want you to go alone." Outside, a figure walked by the glass. The flash was too fast to make out. Then came the splintering sound of glass from the far end of the station. Rachel's radio was turned up. "This place has an intruder. Entrance to the south," reciting the entrance from the south. But before she could finish the call, a tremendous bang echoed across the hallway. The nearest weapon was an old hatchet that Thomas snatched off the wall. "We have to move." They had already passed Bravery, who led the way with a low body and a sharp eye. They moved silently down the narrow corridor past the Messal and the sleeping quarters. Every step felt like a countdown until the generator backup started. Then they heard it. A voice low, "Close mail, I promised you he wouldn't die out there." Thomas's blood froze. They were back, and they didn't intend to leave any evidence behind. Footsteps echoed off the cold concrete walls, slow and steady. The people inside the ranger station were relaxed and not hurried. Thomas became overconfident and gripped the hatchet more tightly. Every muscle in his battered body ached, yet adrenaline overcame the pain. Beside him, like a shadow body, Valor moved silently and deliberately with every stride. With short, well-timed bursts of light from her torch, Rachel led the way across the dim hallway. She had pulled her sidearm now. When they arrived, there was no one in the supply room. Then a silent hallway to the south, and finally the distinct sound of someone else breathing behind the door of the generator room. Thomas held up a hand to indicate stillness. Valor's ears perked up and his body stiffened. He was confined in, "We opened that door," Thomas stated. "We have no idea what awaits us." "Are you ready?" he asked as he approached Rachel. Rachel nodded. As her finger tightened on the trigger, Thomas took a deep breath and kicked the door open. Nothing. The generator room was deserted. It looked that way anyway. "Back!" yelled a glimmer of steel as Rachel's spotlight flashed over the room, revealing tools, a broken chair, and an overturned oil can. The man with the crowbar swung out from behind the generator and Rachel shrieked. Thomas almost missed the metal cutting through the air where his head had been. Heroism was not patient. He leaped forward and clamped down on the attacker's arm, with terrifying accuracy, sending the crowbar crashing to the ground. Instead of screaming out of fear, the man did it out of rage. What a stupid puppy. But Valor would not let go. The man was pushed to the wall by Thomas, who grabbed his other arm and said, "You were supposed to kill me, and they offered money to ignore your persistent blockage of licenses and prying into reports that should have been buried. It was just meant to be that." Thomas clenched his hands. "You abandoned me to perish there." Dalton gave a chilly nod. "Nobody could have survived you, in my opinion. Not during that storm." He then gave Valor a quick glance, although I didn't expect him to. With a deep snarl, Valor's body became rigid. Dalton retreated slowly. "Look, you leave this now, and I'll make sure that you don't have any more problems." Thomas was already shaking his head. "But you and that dog get a medal, retire early, and nobody ever finds out. After everything, you want me to remain silent?" Dalton's hand slowly slid to his belt. Before he could draw, Valor lunged too slowly. Thomas failed to halt the dog this time, but the sheriff struck the ground with a grunt and was trapped by 100 pounds of trained force. He moved nearer and met Dalton's eyes, saying, "You betrayed me. You betrayed your oath." The truth was beginning to come to light by the time Rachel and the deputies got there. Thomas presented the falsified papers. Rachel went over the station logs, while Valor, who remained by Thomas's side, observed everything. The man who had guided them for more than 10 years was quietly arrested, but Dalton Thomas knew the harm went beyond treachery, even as the doors closed behind him. "Everything he touched is compromised," he said to Rachel. "We have to start over with each permission and report." Rachel gave a nod, so we did it together. Something inside Valor had altered that night, and Thomas paced the station walls restlessly as he peered down at him. His ears were constantly awake and his instincts were keen. As the fire flickered in the distance, Thomas sat next to him. You sensed it before any of us did. His eyes never left the darkness outside, but Valor didn't. Thomas sensed that this wasn't the end. The days that followed were quiet and covered in snow. Investigators from the state capitol came, digging for permits, history, and the lies Dalton had been hiding for years. They searched every inch of the ranger station. The truth was revealed in bits and pieces. Thomas delivered statement after statement, his voice calm, but his eyes fatigued. The betrayal still throbbed in the back of his mind like an old wound. A network of unlawful land deals created access for criminal groups and rangers who had been quietly driven out or silenced. For years, he had trusted Dalton. The guy who gave him his badge had abandoned him to die tied like an animal, despite the fact that they had labored side by side, built huts together, and fought fires together. However, Valor was always by his side. He never once accompanied Thomas on any of the interviews, briefings, or quiet midnight walks in the snow. He was no longer viewed by deputies as merely a dog. They started to regard him as a brother, a soldier, or something in between myth and reality. Thomas stood by the station grounds' walled perimeter on the third night following Dalton's arrest. For once, the stars were coldly sparkling over the treetops in a cloudless sky. Slow clouds of breath escaped his lips. Rachel came stealthily up. "They're offering you a transfer," she added. "Back to Helena full benefits counseling desk job." At first, Thomas didn't respond. When their eyes locked, he glanced down at Valor, who was lying at his feet, tail wagging once. At last, Rachel smiled wearily as he said, "Do I look like someone who belongs behind a desk?" He looked at her and didn't think so. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Rachel's grin dimmed. "No. These trees contain far too much money. There are still too many names out there that we haven't yet discovered." Thomas gave a slow nod. "I stayed after Rachel gave him an envelope. I assumed you would state that, if you desire it, this is your formal transfer into the K9 category. Under your direction, Valor has been authorized for reactivation." Quietly, Thomas opened the envelope. There was a clean file within. His name is a unit designation for Valor. Ranger Echo Tactical K9 Unit. "You truly believe I'm qualified?" he inquired. "I believe you already are," Rachel said, glancing between him and the dog. As he crouched next to Valor, Thomas stroked his thick fur. "What do you think?" Partner Valor gave a quiet bark, a quiet, assured voice that said, "Yes." But, as the days went on, the tranquility waned. That feeling of being observed reappeared. Strange disturbances were reported by deputies. Snow footprints that weren't consistent with fauna equipment was moved. Nighttime brief episodes of radio interference. Nothing definitive, but enough to make even the most experienced rangers uneasy. Then, late one night, the security monitor winked out as Thomas was alone himself in the communications cabin going over reports. First static, then black. When he attempted to reconnect the feed, the signal was jammed. At that moment, Valor stood, his ears up, his muscles tight. Thomas went out into the chilly moonlight with a service weapon on his hip, and a second later, the emergency lights outside flickered on. Valor trotted ahead, tail low, nose to the wind. They arrived at the fence's perimeter around the station. Silence and nothing but snow trees, followed by a gentle in order to disregard your continual license obstruction and digging into reports that ought to have been buried. They gave money. That was simply how it was supposed to be. Thomas's hands clenched. I was left to die there by you. Dalton nodded coldly. I don't think anyone could have survived you. Not when that storm was coming. Then, though I didn't anticipate it, he glanced at Valor. Valor snarled low, his body stiffening. Dalton took a hesitant step back. Look, I'll make sure you don't have any more issues if you leave this now. You and that dog earn a medal, retire early, and no one ever finds out. But Thomas was already shaking his head. Do you want me to keep quiet after all this? Slowly, Dalton's hand moved to his belt. Valor leaped too slowly before he could draw. The sheriff grunted to the ground and was caught by 100 pounds of trained force. But Thomas was unable to stop the dog this time. As he approached Dalton, he looked him in the eyes and said, "You betrayed me. You betrayed your oath." By the time Rachel and the deputies arrived, the truth was starting to surface. The forged documents were provided by Thomas. While Valor stayed by Thomas's side and watched everything, Rachel reviewed the station logs. Although the man who had led them for over a decade was subtly taken into custody, Dalton. Even as the doors closed behind him, Thomas realized the damage went beyond betrayal. He told Rachel that everything he touched was compromised. With every authorization and report, we must begin anew. When Rachel nodded, we carried it out together. That night, something had changed within Valor, and Thomas looked down at him, pacing the station walls restlessly. His instincts were sharp, and his ears were always alert. Thomas sat beside him, while the distant fire flickered. Before any of us did, you sensed it. Valor never left his gaze, but neither did the darkness outside. This wasn't the end, Thomas knew. In the days that followed, there was snow and silence. The state capitol sent investigators. They explored every inch of the ranger station, looking for history, permits, and the lies Dalton had been concealing for years. In fragments, the truth came to light. With a steady voice and tired eyes, Thomas made statement after statement. Like an old wound, the treachery continued to pound in the back of his mind. Rangers and criminal gangs that had been either silenced or forced out gained entry through a network of illegal land dealings. He had trusted Dalton for years. They had worked side by side, built huts together, and fought fires together. But the man who had given him his badge had left him to die tethered like an animal. But Valor was on his side no matter what. He never once went with Thomas on any of the briefings, interviews, or peaceful walks in the snow at midnight. Deputies no longer thought of him as just a dog. They began viewing him as a soldier, a sibling, or as something halfway between myth and reality. On the third night after Dalton's arrest, Thomas stood at the walled boundary of the station grounds. The sky was cloudless, and for once the stars were gleaming coldly over the treetops. His breath came out in slow clouds. Rachel crept to her feet. Then she said, "They're offering you a transfer. Back to Helena full benefits counseling desk job." Thomas was silent at first. He looked down at Valor, who was laying at his feet, wagging his tail once as their eyes met. When he said, "Do I look like someone who belongs behind a desk?" Rachel finally smiled wearily. He didn't think so after glancing at her. "Don't you think they'll stop?" Rachel's smile faded. "No, there is too much money in these trees. Too many names are still out there that we haven't found yet." Thomas nodded slowly. Rachel handed him an envelope, and I stayed. "I thought you would. Say that this is your official transfer into the K9 category, if you want it. Valor has been approved for reactivation under your supervision." Thomas opened the envelope quietly. It contained a clean file. The unit designation for his name is Valor, Ranger Tactical K9 Echo Unit. He asked, "You really think I'm qualified?" Rachel looked from him to the dog and replied, "I think you already are." Thomas caressed his thick fur as he knelt beside Valor. "What are your thoughts?" companion Valor barking softly. A confident, serene voice that said, "Yes," but the peace faded over the next few days. The sense of being watched came back. Deputies reported strange disturbances, footprints in the snow that didn't match the fauna. The equipment was relocated. Short bursts of radio interference at night. It was enough to unnerve even the most seasoned rangers, but nothing conclusive. Then, late one evening, as Thomas was alone himself reviewing reports in the communications cabin, the security monitor blinked out. Static at first, then black. The signal was jammed when he tried to reconnect the feed. Valor stood then, his muscles taut, his ears up. With a service weapon at his hip, Thomas ventured out into the cold moonlight, and a moment later, the emergency lights outside flickered on. With its snout facing the wind and its tail down, Valor moved forth. They reached the edge of the fence enclosing the station. Nothing except snow trees and silence. Then a soft... The handler, Rachel Vance, entered next. She was in her early 30s, with deep brown eyes and snow-blonde hair pulled into a tight braid. "Valor's never acted like this before," she said in an awe-filled voice. "Not since he lost his significant other. He seemed to change when he discovered you. I wasn't just another rescue to Thomas, and he knew how I felt as he glanced from her to the dog. He was by your side the entire time." Rachel nodded. "Refused to move until we took you out on a sled, but even then, he continued to stare back at you, as if he wasn't sure we were trustworthy." Thomas glanced at Valor. "You selected me and protected me, but as soon as the warmth had taken hold, the door suddenly sprang open once more." "Something's wrong, Sheriff. We discovered new tire tracks close to Sector 12 and freshly cut chains. It was a deputy with a pale face and a trembling voice. Dalton's face hardened last night when someone was back there." They returned. Pain flared through Thomas's ribs as he sat up. "They're finishing up loose ends and believe I'm still out there." There was silence in the room. The lure's stiff, pointed ears and tail stood out. Something was about to happen. Snow continued to fall outside in gentle, regular waves, blanketing the trees in a new layer of white. The ranger station had never felt so silent. However, there was a lot of tension inside, with deputies whispering behind closed doors and the sheriff. Since the new tire tracks were found, Dalton had remained in the communications room. Whoever had returned from whatever was going on out there wasn't done yet. Thomas was wearing a heated blanket and sitting on a wooden seat close to the side window. His ribs and jaw were deeply bruised, and his hands were still bandaged, but his intellect was clearer now. The impression that the woodland was holding its breath persisted in his mind. There was something hiding behind the quiet. At his feet, like a sentinel, was courage. Not sleeping, never sleeping, yet breathing steadily and slowly while chewing. To most, the scar across his eye gave him a frightening appearance, but to Thomas, it revealed a deeper meaning. Yes, pain, but also survival. Still refusing the painkillers, raised an eyebrow as Rachel Vance arrived quietly with a hot mug of coffee. Thomas took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "They make me groggy, and I can't afford that at the moment." She sat next to him and spoke quietly. "Federal investigators are being brought in since this situation is more than just poaching. Overly well organized and overly tidy, with maps, equipment, and the audacity to abandon a man for dead." Thomas gazed down upon Valor. "And a mistake was made by someone." Rachel followed his eyes. "Courage. They found me, even though none of them were supposed to be there. They were dispatched. They were not lost." Rachel appeared perplexed. Nobody sent them. Thomas leaned a little forward. Then another thing happened. Rachel had spent years teaching K9 on my units, so she knew when things went beyond explanation. Thus, there was a pause. Not one of uncertainty, but one of realization. She whispered softly, "He hasn't left your side once. He waits for your approval, even when I call." Thomas gave the dog a quick look. "He makes me think of the ranger I was before all this devotion, perseverance, and constant vigilance." Do you think he could work with you?" Rachel asked after hesitating. Thomas blinked. "You mean he's retired from the military?" But Valor's never connected with anyone like this if you wanted to keep him. You'd both need to train and build the partnership, but I think he's already chosen, they said, citing the fact that there was technically too much trauma. At first, Thomas didn't respond. He didn't blink as his eyes remained fixed on the puppy. Then Thomas said, "If he's willing, I won't let him go," implying that there was something between them that was deeper than words. The silence was broken at that moment by a loud bark. It was briefly restrained by bravery. He rose quickly, his muscles stiff, his ears back, and his nose high. Rachel leaped to her feet. Why is that youngster barking again, louder and more urgently this time? Thomas ignored the pain as a faint metal-on-metal noise emerged from the rear of the building. Yelling through his limbs, he said, "That was the garage door," and took the radio from the bench. The power went out before he could key it. Everything turned dark. With a wobbly cone, Rachel's flashlight beam sliced into the room. "Stay here," she urged, "and I'll see what it's like." However, Valor snarled, a deep, guttural noise. He took action to block the door. Rachel stopped. Thomas spoke in a soothing tone. "He doesn't want you to go alone." A figure passed by the glass outside. A flash that was too quick to discern. Then there was the sound of glass splintering at the station's far end. Rachel turned up her radio. "There is an invader here. Entrance on the south repetition of the south entrance." However, a huge bang reverberated through the hole before she could complete the call. Thomas grabbed an ancient hatchet from the wall, the closest weapon. "We must relocate." They were already in front of Valor, who led the way with low body and keen gaze. They passed the sleeping quarters and the Masul in quiet as they made their way down the small hallway. It felt like a countdown with each step until the generator backup kicked on. Then they heard it. A voice, close, low male. "He wouldn't perish out there, I assured you." The blood in Thomas froze. They had returned, and they had no intention of leaving any witnesses. Slow, steady footsteps reverberated off the chilly concrete walls. The ranger station's occupants were assured, and not in a rush. Overconfident Thomas tightened his hold on the hatchet. His beaten body ached in every muscle, but the pain was overwhelmed by adrenaline. Valor walked beside him like a shadow body, silent and purposeful with each step. Rachel led the way, her torch beam piercing the dark corridor in brief, well-timed spurts. Now she had drawn her sidearm. The supply room was empty when they arrived, followed by a quiet south hallway before the distinct sound of someone else. Breathing heard from behind the generator room door. Thomas signaled silence with a raised hand. His body tensed, and Valor's ears twitched. He was trapped in, Thomas said. "We open that door, we don't know what's waiting. You ready?" As he drew near to Rachel. After her finger tightened on the trigger, Rachel nodded. After inhaling deeply, Thomas kicked the door open. Nothing there. Was nobody in the generator room. At least that's how it appeared. A gleam of steel said, "Back," as the light from Rachel's flashlight swept over the room, exposing tools, a shattered chair, and an overturned oil can. Rachel yelled as the man with the crowbar swung out from behind the generator. Where his head had been, Thomas dodged the metal slicing through the air just in time. Heroism didn't wait. With frightful precision, he sprang forward and clamped down on the assailant's arm, causing the crowbar to fall with a clang. The man screamed in anger rather than fear. What a dumb dog. However, Valor refused to let go. Thomas took hold of the man's other arm and pinned him to the wall, saying, "You were meant to murder me," and she murmured softly as she sat beside him. "Since this is more than a case of poaching, federal investigators are being brought in." Overly neat and well-organized, Thomas looked down on Valor, armed with maps, gear, and the gall to leave a man for dead. And somebody made a mistake. Rachel followed his gaze. Bravery. None of them were meant to be there, but they discovered me. They weren't lost. They were sent out. Rachel looked puzzled. They were not sent. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Then, something else occurred. There was a pause, not one of hesitation, but one of realization, because Rachel, who had taught K9 on my units for years, recognized when something went beyond explanation.